Great, welcome. My name is Debbie Doyle. I'm the meetings manager here at the American Historical Association. Thank you for attending our session on History Gateways, what I'm doing differently in my History Introductory course, which is part of the AHA Colloquium series of virtual AHA. We're excited to have you join us and are looking forward to a productive discussion. I'd like to thank our generous sponsors, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Stanton Foundation, the History Channel, and Oxford University Press. You can support virtual AHA and other AHA activities by joining the AHA, or if you're already a member, making a donation today. We'll post links with details in the chat later during the webinar. A few logistical things to cover before we start. By registering for or participating in the AHA's webinars, participants and panelists agree to abide by our Code of Professional Conduct. Please use the Q&A function to submit questions to the presenters. We hope to address all relevant questions, but also want to be mindful of the time, so we may paraphrase or combine questions. If you'd like to be a part of the conversation on social media, remember to use the virtual AHA hashtag. Finally, a quick reminder that this webinar is being recorded, and we will share the recording on the AHA's YouTube channel later this week. Finally, I'd like to introduce the chair of the session today, Daniel McInerney from Utah State University. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Debbie, and hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Dan McInerney. I'm a professor emeritus in the Department of History at Utah State University. I've served as an advisor on the AHA tuning project and now as an advisor on the AHA Gateways project as well. Our talks today are going to be brief with my four wonderful colleagues, all of whom have worked on so steadily and so thoughtfully on questions about teaching within our discipline. And I want to begin by just having everybody get on the same stage here about the nature of gateways itself. And to do that, I'm going to try something that I hope works. Let's see. Sorry, folks. Make sure. Boy, right into a meeting and already there's a technical issue. I want to, oh, geez. My apologies. I want to share my screen. And there it is. Just provide a, boy, this is a lot trickier than I thought. Just provide a few thoughts about the nature of History Gateways itself. Sorry for the little problem there getting these slides on. We're very fortunate in the American Historical Association to be part of a disciplinary organization that for so long has been steadily, and again, very thoughtfully, keeping us alert to the nature of teaching in our discipline, asking some of the critical questions that we need to address within our field. And the key question is a very simple one. What are we trying to accomplish in our courses? This is a question that the AHA has been asking us to consider for decades now. And we've taken many different approaches to this, all of which turn out to be quite well connected to one another. Well, especially since the late 20th century, one of the focuses of this question has been on the content. Whose story are we telling in our classes? How inclusive, or unfortunately, how exclusive is the content of our teaching itself? And a second set of questions that quickly arose has been a focus on methods, on the pedagogy of our teaching. And we're especially thankful to our colleagues in the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. Colleagues you're probably aware of: Lendl Calder, Leah Shopko, David Pace, and so many others. That question, or those two questions, have been developed even further beginning in 2012 with the AHA tuning project, which extended our focus about teaching to another issue, the question of outcomes, with the question that tuning always asks: when students complete a course, when they complete a curriculum, when they complete a degree, what should they know? What should they understand? What should they be able to do? Pretty simple question, no jargon there, but boy, is that tough to answer. and the attention to skills as well as to content and our methods in a class all fit into this issue. At the same time, we were asked across the nation to focus more attention on accountability, on the dreaded issue of assessment too. Not only paying attention to what we're teaching and how we're teaching it, but asking another question: is it working? What do students learn? Do we know they're learning in our courses? With all those issues that we've been discussing for so many years, in the past few years, we've, as an organization and as national entities addressing higher education, have focused their attention on questions of equity. A little less attention on us for the moment, more attention on the students in our classrooms. Who are they? Do we know who those students are in a changing student body? Do we know what their goals are, not just our goals? And do we understand what happens to them next? Not only whether they finish our course, what happens as they pursue other courses, as they try to complete their own degrees? And that equity focus, which has brought so many other teaching activities together, what that equity focus has been particularly shaped by is this May 2017 article in Perspectives by Dr. Andrew Koch of the John N. Gardner Institute for Excellence in Undergraduate Education. What Drew looked at here was data that the Gardner Institute had collected over the years from 32 different institutions with over 28,000 student records. What happens to students in our introductory courses? Our introductory history courses are designed as gateways, not only to the study of our discipline. For most of us, those courses are also part of a gen ed program, an introduction to higher education. But too often, those gateways serve as roadblocks as students pursue their college degrees. And most importantly, those courses act as roadblocks for first year, first generation, low income, and racially and ethnically underrepresented students. That's why Drew gave a subtitle to his essay. It's a wake-up call for historians. Those courses are a problem. For these students, experience just alarming rates of D, W, and I grades that lead too many to fail to complete a course, that affect their retention on a campus, and lead so many to fail to earn a degree. It is a wake-up that we need to be aware of. How our work affects these students. Look, there's so many data points in this study. I just want to show you something very simple and very disturbing. The rates of DFWI grades for students in intro US history courses across 32 campuses, broken down by demographic groups. In white, in the upper center, the figure that a quarter of our students usually wind up with a DFWI grade. Those demographic groups at the top of the chart are the students who fall below that DFWI rate of 25%. But look at the demographic groups below and how high those averages run. It led our own organization to argue that introductory history courses disproportionately choked the academic progress for the least advantaged students. Again, our gateway courses acting as roadblocks. What do we do about this? First of all, we try to understand the data, what it means, and the kind of responsibility we hold here. In the Gateways Project, working with the Gardner Institute and funding from the Andrew Mellon Foundation, has started to make suggestions on what we can do in our courses, in our curricula. Most importantly, knowing who those students are in our classroom, being attentive not just to their deficits, but to the assets they bring into a course. Explaining as clearly as possible our own expectations within a class, the purposes of the course, the assignments we give, the verbs we use within those instructions, and the broader goals of a course itself. Explaining to students as clearly as possible, these are non-specialists in our field, introduced to the post-secondary study of history. How do you make a solid achievement in a project, an exercise, in the course as a whole? What are the broader skills that you'll learn not only within this course, but also that you'll take with you outside of campus into civic life and your careers? An emphasis on active learning, frequent support to students, and also steady and encouraging feedback. I know these are all very broad, general suggestions. What we want to do in our presentations today is to ask 4 of our colleagues to give an overview of what they're doing in their classes on a concrete, practical level to make a change in this very disturbing story about the consequences of our courses for the least advantaged students. The first colleague who's going to speak is Dr. Reginald Ellis. Reggie is an assistant dean in the School of Graduate Studies and Research and an associate professor of history and African American studies at Florida A&M University. His research focuses on the history of historically Black colleges and universities and on African American leaders during the Jim Crow era. He's the author of Between Washington and Du Bois, The Racial Politics of James Edward Shepard. And his teaching has involved nearly a decade of long work with the AHA Tuning Project, both as a faculty member and as an administrator. Reggie's going to talk about a new team-taught interdisciplinary course at Florida A&M that combines history and architecture. And it's focused on preserving the material culture and the communal memory of a struggling town. Reggie?
Good afternoon and welcome to this panel. Dan, great presentation, and thank you for really setting the foundation for our conversation today. I'm talk very briefly about this new course that 2 colleagues in the School of Architecture and Graphic Design here at Florida A&M University and I are developing, and that we will begin to teach in the fall of 2021. Before I talk about that course, I want to just kind of tag on to the conversation that Dan had earlier. When we look at the DWI rate, one of the things that I started to do very early on when these data points were introduced to us here at Florida A&M University, especially as it relates to our introductory level courses, is I started to really let our students know in our course syllabus during our presentations of the overview of the course, the skill set that they would gain from the course. So when we went through the course syllabi, I would write on the board, these are the skills at the end of the semester, whether you make an A, B, C, or D, these are the skills that you will be able to take away. This is why we are doing these readings. This is why we're taking these exams and things of that nature. And you could see the light bulb for the students go off very quickly. Another aspect that I will talk about is I actually developed a course back in 2013 And I taught it in a flipped classroom format, which means that the students did the vast majority of their work outside of the class. And then we used class time as an opportunity to work with other groups, other students in the class, to find best practices to solve the issue, the larger issue. By the end of that semester, I was able to invite individuals from the city of Tallahassee who were a part of the city management team as it that was looking at ways of revitalizing certain aspects of the community, parts of the town that were historically African American, that was now becoming more middle class, more prominent communities, but individuals who lived in those areas were now being pushed out. And so when I brought those individuals into my class and they saw the type of presentations that these students were doing, one of the things that one of the city managers said that I never thought about hiring a historian when we looked at the revitalization of communities or redevelopment, if you will, of communities. I always assumed that you could get an engineer or any other group of individuals to do this type of work. So he actually has hired one of my former students who's working on a project now. So it is very important from my assessment that as historians, we don't just look at the students that are coming in, and assume that all of them will be historians when they graduate. B, is our job to explain to them every aspect of the course and why we are doing what it is that we're doing. And C, to Dan's one of his points is it is our job also to mentor the students throughout the process. Don't assume that they don't know or don't assume that they can't do. So this course that we are teaching, that we are planning on teaching in the fall of 2021, it really started out with my class that I developed a few years ago. And so that course really looked at the several Black neighborhoods here in Tallahassee, Florida, a historic Frenchtown neighborhood, which is a community that James Baldwin actually visited back in the 1950s. Frenchtown community, the Allen subdivision. So there are several communities that the course looked at, and the students actually went in and did oral history interviews. They went to some county commission meetings to find out the process of where the money was going to go and as it relates to revitalization. And they had to read several historical manuscripts relating to historic Black neighborhoods. One of the books that we used was Du Bois's The Philadelphia Negro, which focused on the Ninth Ward of Philadelphia. At the end of that project, the students were able to tell a historical narrative of these historic Black communities and the families that lived there that possibly no longer live there. And so I was approached by some colleagues in our School of Architecture because they were looking at environmental change and how the environment has changed living patterns. And one of the things that they said they could look at the architecture of the homes and the architecture of the neighborhood, but the one piece that they did not have is the human context of that story. And so they actually brought me in, and so my role in this particular course will be to train not only history students, but also architecture majors on oral history and oral historical study, and really showing one of the things that Jim Grossman always says, that everything has a history. And so we will provide 3 lectures, guest lectures from individuals outside the university, and I will provide a lecture as well, marrying the two fields. But again, our job very early on, we have a very detailed syllabus. We'll talk about the skills that the students will gain from that course, and how those skills are transferable. The students are very excited when they take this type of course, because now history is real. We're not just talking about subjects in the past that they may feel are not relevant. They now understand that these are my communication skills, these are my analytical skills, and this is how it's transferable. And so, I'll stop here, but I actually stole that idea from David, right? Several years ago, he talked about the cold call concept, right? And how his students had the ability to make the cold call. And so when I was meeting with my students, I was informing them that if you can master these skills, don't worry about the grade per se. If you master these skills, you will be able to get a job in any field that you desire. And again, I think that as a historian, particularly when you're looking at lower level courses where students may or may not major in your field of study, that's our role. And so I'll be open for any questions that you all have. Thank you. You're muted.
Sorry. I love the way at Florida A&M, Reggie and his colleagues have taken the lead, not only in developing this understanding of the skills that are broadly developed and transferable out of our history courses, but the way you break down the walls of the classroom itself and open it up to the larger community. Thanks very much, Reggie. Our second presentation is going to be by a colleague of mine I'm very lucky to work with, Julia Gossard. Julia is an assistant professor of history at Utah State University in our history department. She's a historian of 18th century France. She has a forthcoming book called Coercing Children.
Actually, we changed the name.
You did?
Yes, it's young subjects, children, state building, and social reform in the 18th century French world. So pardon.
Good. That title is going to get you in less trouble. Yeah. And it examines the roles of children in social reform, state building, imperial projects in early modern France. But she's been a very inventive teacher in courses on the history of early modern and modern Europe and on the Atlantic. Her talk today is going to look at a way she's tackled a core skill in our introductory courses: how to analyze historical documents. We just can't assume that students will do this in a way that reaches our disciplinary goals. And what Julie's going to talk about is a graphic organizer that she's developed to help her students master this kind of skill. Julia.
Hi, thank you everybody for being here this afternoon. And thank you, Dan, for inviting me to be a part of this panel with you, Reggie, David, and John. I think that all of our topics really have some nice overlapping qualities to them. As you were talking, Dan, and Reggie as well, thinking about these transferable skills, that's one of the things looking at my general education survey, which has up until, I think this is the last semester, we're calling it Western Civ, it'll be history of Europe, of modern Europe in the summer and fall, has been what transferable skills can my students get out of my general education survey? A lot of these students are first year students, whether in their first semester or their second semester. And I've been concerned about what can they take from my class and apply both to their academic career as well as to their lives as 21st century citizens. So as is not surprising, being one of Dan's colleagues, most of our department has gone through many iterations of the AHA tuning project, where we're very, I think, adaptive and attentive to learning objectives. And when I was looking at my learning objectives in the fall of 2016, I realized that there were three things that I have highlighted here in purple that my students were really struggling with, which was analyzing competing complex interpretations of historical events, analyzing primary sources that reflect the larger historical trends, and assessing the credibility and usefulness of primary and secondary sources. And really at the core of those challenges that students were facing was they can certainly read a short primary source. They can get through, a 2 to 4 page document from the past and read it. But as many of you probably have seen, they read it as if it's a novel. They read it more for plot and for content, as if I am going to quiz them on the minutia of the details provided there. And while some of us might do that to see if the students read, that's not really the point that we want our students to do. We want them to be able to analyze this document, to talk about the historical significance, to talk about the connections of this document to the larger historical era. Also, troubling to me in the fall of 2016, as I'm sure many of you were troubled as well, is that students were starting to trust more and more of these documents, look at them without taking them with a grain of salt, just trusting them because they were published. So there was this emphasis there that they were failing to acknowledge, or really failing to understand, that documents have inherent biases and that we must always go through the analysis process to look at the background of documents, to look at the authors and the creators to fully understand this. So I realized, well, these are some of the big challenges that I have. Before, I had a lot of textbook reading, and I actually decided then to shift this and to prioritize primary source reading assignments over that of textbook assignments, while I still provide some short secondary source material, whether that comes from textbooks, historical articles. I put the focus primarily on primary sources for students to read. I want them to read those primary sources or analyze a political cartoon, listen to music, something like that, so they're really getting their hands dirty with these primary sources. We also always bring up primary sources in class, and I try to model analysis for them as much as possible, realizing that getting them to overcome these challenges is going to take continual practice. And each time that I can have them practice one of these, the better. So we start early in the semester by really breaking it down. Now, by doing that, that means in my second class session for History 1110 Western Civ, it means I have to take 30 minutes to really break down a document with them. So this does take time to do, but it's worth it because by week 3 or week 4, they are doing the practices that I have modeled. They are being able to analyze this deeply and well. So I've decided that really I've shifted this from just textbook material more to primary source material, both in weekly assignments. What I'm going to talk about today are reading grids, which is a graphic organizer, as well as analyzing documents on midterm and final exams. And I've tried to scaffold this learning as much as possible, showing it with them together, then having them practice something very small, then having them work on a graphic organizer, which then eventually will be able to help them write an exam essay. This is something that I wasn't originally going to talk about when we first proposed this panel way back when, pre-corona, in the before times that happened. But as we've shifted to remote online learning, my class has been moved to asynchronous instruction, which has made modeling primary source analysis a little bit more challenging, because then it would just be me talking to a screen, right? And while I still do that and I provide tutorials, I've actually implemented a smaller weekly activity that really is exactly what I would do in class, where I would bring in a primary source and I'd have them play and analyze with the primary source in class. I've now wrapped up into weekly assignments. So here you can see one of my examples where they had, their assignment had been to listen and read rock and roll music from the 1960s. That's primarily politically critical. It came from Eastern Europe as well as from Western Europe, as well as from the United States. And here they're really kind of analyzing these lyrics, thinking about how it connects back to the class material. And this is a way through asynchronous learning, they're still being able to practice that small primary source analysis through a small assignment, and it's very guided. And that really gives them the confidence to be able to read these primary sources well. They also feel rewarded for doing the reading too, in many ways, which I'm sure many of us have had that moment with remote instruction where students are going, well, this is a lot of busy work. Well, if you kind of reward them and make it part of their grade, they're going to take it seriously and they're going to do it. And students have to do one of these per week. So this is kind of the way that what I would have done in class is now moved to a remote capacity. I also use, for those of you who have it, not every school has Canvas, but there is a Canvas plugin called Atomic Assessments, which I actually use to build these, which create an assignment seamlessly in page on the Canvas page that they might be looking at, so they never have to click away to go to an assignment. So that also makes it much more accessible for students to be able to access right then. So that's kind of a small part of this. That's that weekly practice, making sure that they're getting as much face time and as much time as possible to be able to analyze these primary sources in smaller ways. But the big thing that I've discovered is they really do need to be walked through the analysis process. And I got this idea from Dr. Julie Hardwick at the University of Texas at Austin, who was my doctoral advisor, and I TA'd for her for many years while I was doing my doctoral work. And she used graphic organizers, especially in upper division courses, for students to really break down academic articles. So thinking about, historians, historiography, source evaluation. And I thought, well, I can use something very similar for primary sources to have students stop approaching primary sources like a novel. So I thought about what are the 5 criteria that we use when we look at primary sources? Well, the identification of the primary source, the argument and the motive, the audience and the bias, the historical, and then I've put in parentheses here, and this is especially important for remote learning, course connections as well, and then a reflection. How do students reflect upon these elements? I'm sure that these are things that you already do in your own classroom, but putting them in a graphic organizer, in literally a worksheet, makes a difference for students because they are forced to confront each one of these criteria and practice their analysis. So I'm just going to walk you through what this looks like. For identification, and I've been doing this since fall of 2016 over 6 semesters, so this has actually really been revised. I consider this to be a living document. Every semester I change something in this document about what it might look like. Before, with identification, the first iteration of this was just identify the document, which was not enough. I needed to provide a lot more scaffolding and a lot more guidance to my students of what did I mean by identification. So we start out with who are the authors, also having them look up what that person did, right? The background of that person is super important for them to start thinking about bias, start thinking about perspective. When and where was it produced? Interestingly, students struggle with this one, especially when you're using translations. They will often put the modern translation instead of saying, Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote, the Social Contract in 1762 or 63. Can't remember off the top of my head. They'll write, oh, it was translated by, Dan McInerney in 2002. Right. And so that's one of those things too, where we can bring their attention back to the document and explain how things are translated, how we're accessing these documents, and what type of a document is this. And if I'm going to update this for next semester, I wouldn't just say what type of document. I would say what type of document or historical object is this, because you can also give your students paintings or music or a picture, a political cartoon, and that makes them start to think about what types of arguments or what types of presentation are they going to see through those primary sources. And that's worth 10 points. It's not worth a whole lot of points out of 100, but it's worth 10 points. Then you move on to argument and motive. Again, the first iteration of this was very basic. What's the purpose of this document? And students would often write just to tell us information about the past. They wouldn't necessarily be able to move beyond that to see that every single thing that they interact with in my class has a motive or has a purpose behind it, and to place that within a larger historical context. So I've updated it to be the main argument or the purpose, as well as subpoints, really get them to understand how is the author or the creator backing up their main argument, or how are they making this point relevant and clear to their audience. Students have really mastered this particular category in my class. This is one that I don't often have to spend a lot of time with them on. And I think it's because in those shorter apply knowledge activities, I have a lot of the prompts that are geared towards having them think about the motive of primary sources, having them think, why was it created? What is the larger purpose? What is the historical significance? The third section is audience and bias. So, bias has become a 4-letter word. It is a 4-letter word, but it's become akin to those naughty 4-letter words in many students' minds, where they'll look at a historical document and they're like, well, this is objective fact. There is no bias. Or if there is bias, they'll be like, well, it's biased and it's bad and it's illegitimate. And getting them to see, though, that everything that they're reading, everything that they're interacting with has an inherent bias to it. It's how the document is used, though, that we can think about its legitimacy. So this is trying to get them to think about perspective, about background, about bias, and seeing that everything has bias. My hope here too is that by engaging students in this way, by having them take a critical eye towards these primary sources, they'll do the same in their own lives when they're reading news, when they're reading Facebook posts, right? To think about the inherent biases of the author and the creator. So thinking about their 21st century lives is important for me too. And oftentimes in either lectures or in face-to-face conversations when we're in the classroom, we'll talk about these biases and we'll talk about how they were used and why bias is important. So I try to make that connection not only between this is a written assignment, but also I try to bring that into the classroom. And I think as most of us are probably thinking about ways to do this in remote learning, you can also do that in lectures, right, that you've recorded as well. Talk about the background, talk about the bias. This fourth section used to just be called historical connections, where I would ask the students to provide me a little bit of background information on how does the source that they read reflect the historical era. My problem was in fall 2020, I had the sense that a lot of my students only watched the earlier lectures, and then the later lectures, they kind of fell off the boat a little bit, which I'm sure many of you have dealt with as well. So for spring 2021, I decided to update this. And I decided to say, all right, you have to tell me how this document relates back to that week's lectures and other reading assignments. You have to make a detailed connection between that. And I will say it's only week 5 here, but from anecdotal evidence, I've seen an uptick in the number of videos that they've watched because they are again being required to make this clear connection. Because in fall 2020, everything that I got was, well, this reminds me of the Enlightenment. And I'm like, the fall of the USSR? Like, you know, we've talked about everything else to that point. So for remote online instruction, this is a great way, again, to get those connections to those lectures put in here. And then finally, I have them do a historical and a present reflection. This gives them an opportunity to express themselves, to think about their thoughtful reflection on the primary source. Do they see connections to other history or to the present day as well? We just finished up the Industrial Revolution, in which they read Adam Smith. And so a lot of them are talking about, oh, I see sort of critiques of capitalism and I see the problems with the working class. And, you know, Adam Smith, it got very interesting here for students to be able to see connections to the modern day so that they don't think about history just as change, but they also think about some continuity there as well. So each of these 5 criteria gives students that walking through process of primary source analysis and also grades them on it and encourages them to keep going. I grade a little bit easy at the start of the semester, and by the end of the semester with these, I'm grading pretty harshly because it should be that students are becoming more and more familiar with this process. Again, from anecdotal experience, I've had great success with students being able to master the analysis. But what's the data behind it? I don't know if your institution uses the IDEA database. Ours does, and this is sort of our student evaluation. And there are a number of objectives that they give us that students have to answer if they feel that they have made relevant or significant progress on. And from fall 2016 to fall 2020, there are 3 objectives that stood out to me that students say that they have made considerable progress on. Learning to analyze and critically evaluate ideas, arguments, and point of views. The kind of average there was 4.7 out of 5. So that shows that students feel that they have mastered that analysis process. The other one that's more recent is learning to apply course material. That was a 4.6 out of a 5. So they're feeling like they're taking those transferable skills and they're applying that material. And then the one that surprised me was they're learning to apply knowledge and skills to benefit others or serve the public good, which is 4.7 out of 5. When I talked to a couple of former students of mine who now serve as undergraduate teaching fellows through our program here for that same class, I asked them, what did they think that this meant? And they said, well, that to me is about a learning to apply knowledge in my own life, right? So by reading a primary source, I'm able to analyze information that comes my way. So I'm able to become an informed citizen. I'm able to make decisions about what I think is legitimate versus illegitimate news, which I thought was a pretty cool takeaway from this primary source analysis. So I don't know if this is necessarily anything different that I'm doing in my course, but this graphic organizer certainly has worked for me. And it's a way, again, of breaking down the process for students to see primary source analysis. And I think that's where I'll end, but if you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A comment. You can also find this on my website if you want to use it and update it for your own classes.
Thanks so much, Julia. This reminds me so much of a colleague who's an art historian. I think she's at Brandeis University, Marianne Winkelmas, who has developed what she calls the tilt approach to work within classes, transparency in teaching and learning. And one of the most important parts is to break down a task into understandable steps, especially for students who are just being introduced to a discipline at the post-secondary level. As Julia mentioned, we're asking you too for questions you might have about any of these presentations, about the History Gateways project itself. Please put those into the Q&A box. And also, most importantly, steps you've taken in your courses to make the kind of changes that can affect this disturbing issue about DFWI grades for our least advantaged students in our courses. And let me turn next to another colleague that I just had. All of these people have just been so wonderful to work with over the years. David Trowbridge is an associate professor in the Department of History, and he's also the director of the African and African American Studies program at Marshall University. He's the author of a 2-volume history of the United States, along with articles in the Journal of American History and the Journal of African American History. And he's also the creator of something Reggie talked about before, a website called Clio. Simple to get to, just in Google, just type Clio Marshall University. This is a website that offers the public information about nearby historical and cultural sites. And I found it gives students one heck of a great research project in their own communities to contribute postings to the Clio website. In his presentation today, David's not going to talk so much about Clio itself, but he's going to talk about a simple question that many of us have. How do we better balance content and skills in our intro courses for today's students, this shifting and dynamic student body that we have in the third decade of the 21st century? He's been working with the National Humanities Alliance's program, Study the Humanities, a toolkit that the National Humanities Alliance has produced. And this work has been designed to help develop students' learning, their careers, and their civic life. David?
Thank you, Dan. And speaking of the National Humanities Alliance, I would just mention that on the 10th of March is National Humanities Advocacy Day. And if you are willing, they would really love it if you would go to their website, National Humanities Alliance. I think it's NHAalliance.com. But we need advocates. The humanities need advocates. There is a proposal right now to offer an additional $135 million of humanities funding via the NEH, and our elected representatives need to hear from us. So there's my plug for the NHA and their work. This is a little bit different than what I thought I was going to talk about, because there ended up being this pandemic, and I thought it would be maybe a bit more honest for me to talk about. First of all, I hope none of this comes off as having this idea that I have any kind of solutions or whatever. Anything I've learned has come from mistakes, and I've made a lot of them. And so so here we are. And certainly I struggle with the DFW grades. I teach a 4-4 load in the heart of Appalachia. One of the questions that came in, I've tried to answer some of them. It disappeared, and perhaps I think what happened was the person who asked the question realized that the question could have been taken 2 different ways, and that was, do these students belong here? And I think that that's two different kinds of questions. Do they belong here in a positive sense? Is college right for them? And I assume that's what they meant, and then they thought maybe they meant that they were making a judgment. I've asked both of those kinds of questions, and as someone who has both a GED and a PhD, I am grateful for people who were probably a little too kind um, and decided that I belonged. So one of the things I've learned, um, in this pandemic is sustained learning requires joy. And I know this because I have a 6 and a 7-year-old, and they are doing Zoom classes here. And there's a teacher every morning who somehow manages to fool me in thinking she wants to be there. And that is probably the most important thing. And I've watched them and I thought I can do this too, right? If you don't have 6 and 7-year-olds right now, just imagine all of these squares filled up, and I'm just trying to, like, how does a teacher go, stop picking your nose? I don't understand this. So I figure if they can bring that joy into the classroom, so can I. We can all force ourselves to learn something. We can pull an all-nighter, but sustained learning day in and day out requires joy. And so it's important to me, what I've learned in this pandemic is I need to create these classes, if I'm in a Zoom window or whatever I am, that I want to be there. If I don't want to be there, there's no chance anyone else is going to. And so that's changed me in sort of rethinking a lot of what I've done in ways that I hope will be helpful. And so one of the things I did is I made a video syllabus. I did this for all of my classes, but especially in the intro classes. And it's a lot of the stuff that I would tell them on the first day of class, but I go a little deeper. And so if I go over the section where we're talking about, my office hours and how to get a hold of me, I also talk about how to write an email to a professor. And that, as someone who was new to college, was something I wish I would have known, because I think I would have been more apt to reach out if I would have known how to do it. I explain my goals in grading. I have model assignments where I will turn in an assignment to myself that is both really good at times and also has some of the standard mistakes. And then they see me filming with, I've got a green screen and I use OBS, which is really simple to learn. If I can do it, it's not that hard. And then they can see my face as I'm going through either the syllabus or this fake assignment I've turned into myself, where I'm like, oh, that's really good. Or, I found that works a lot better than marking up papers with symbols that I didn't understand when I was in college, so I never did anything with them. PowerPoints, I found out that we can use that to guide ourselves. And so I will put things like questions. And then you see this panel that I've got. I get really into technology, and so this is me at my meest. I can actually, like, those little pads, those colored pads, they can make applause or cricket sounds to try to be funny so that the students are more apt to finally, and then of course I tell them, just type your questions, and you can do that anonymously. So it's easier for them to ask questions than it's been in the past. Discussion boards is essay prep. I try to explain the process of history, how the most important thing is making arguments backed by evidence. And instead of having a bunch of discussion boards like I used to have, I only have 3. But the requirement is higher. And I coach them and bring them to the point where they are making arguments backed by evidence and sources, because they can always retract and repost. What I found was that ended up making for a lot better essays and demystify what I was looking for, because they were able to learn that early. So it's one thing to say their midterms or their final exams are better than their midterms, but what if I can get them to have a better midterm? That's oftentimes where our DFW comes in, where students, that's where we lose them, is that midterm. So that's what I try to coach them up to, is so they have a good midterm, and then they tend to stay in the class. I also scheduled meetings. All my students had 3 individual meetings with me. Again, I have a 4-4 load in the heart of Appalachia. These meetings this time around were done through Calendly, which is a free app, and they sign up for times. And then I just had one Zoom room open all day, and whatever time they signed up for, that was my schedule for the day. I spent a lot of time talking about just their lives. And so I learned a lot from that process. And then I think the video syllabus helped. You can see I'm actually holding the book. one of the books I assign and talking about it and telling them what I'm looking for in the assignment. So there was no question. I also try to tie everything. This is a repeat of what other people have said, so I'll be really, really, really brief. My students, 100% of them, they care about employment. That's why they're there. So I care about employment. I have students do a lot of oral history projects, and as a result, I have this repository of people I need to thank. Thank you for taking the time to talk with my students. And by the way, you have an amazing, interesting life. I'm in a room, a Zoom room or something almost every day with young people. If you were me, what would you tell them? And then I kind of collect those stories and give them back. So I can talk about written and oral communication, curiosity and adaptability, relationships, the perspectives of others, becoming a good listener. And if historians aren't good listeners, man, we're doing this wrong. And so it's been nice to have people to talk about and have those stories to share, to intersperse in what might otherwise feel like a one-way lecture. If you care about people, you go where they are. So Clio started because of this. I was wondering how to reach my students, and I was just looking down and noticed one of my students who didn't bring in paper to take notes had a tattoo of the outline of West Virginia. And I thought, you dummy, he's telling you what he cares about. He's literally wearing it on his would-be sleeve. Talk about West Virginia history. And about the third time I did that, he reached over to a friend or someone and grabbed paper and pen and started taking notes. So Clio is this example, but you don't have to use Clio. You can use any platform you want where the students publish short pieces about places or things or topics that matter to them. You're the co-author. You're coaching them up to the point when it's good. And yes, I do this in the intro survey with freshmen. Actually, I think it's easier with freshmen than anything else. And then I show them their progress. In that last meeting, I showed them their first draft when they had no problem hitting the green button to submit. They thought they were done. They had written the last word on the topic. The night before, they had Googled it. I talk with them kind of kindly and say, you know, if I go look at this, I'm glad you use a source. If I went and looked at this source, am I going to see the exact same thing? And they assure me that they've reworded things. By the end of it, they just bury their heads when they see that first draft because they've made phone calls, they've interviewed people, they found out that some of what they wrote was incorrect, and they're not sure what they have is correct. And then I show them, you know, and I tell them, and I mean it, you have written something that adds to the aggregate value of human knowledge, and I enjoyed it, and it's got my name next to yours, and I'm proud of it, and I'm proud of you. Another platform that's really good for this, Reclaim Hosting. I'm not paid to give promos here. It's just they have a thing called Domain of One's Own, where the students for a very low price can have their own website and build that. That can be done at an introductory level class. It can be done in a capstone class as well. That's just one idea. I didn't want to just talk about Clio, but I think of this really as a pedagogical exercise. Clio forces me to teach the way I know I'm supposed to, because at the end, when I hit the publish button, it's got my name next to their name, and I'm accountable. And so I also spend a lot of time celebrating my students' success. Here in the corner, that's Haley. Haley started with a Clio entry, a 6-paragraph article about an African-American school in her hometown that she didn't know existed. There she is dedicating the historical marker that she raised money for. All right, that wasn't the assignment. You can see her, you can see the joy in that. I didn't assign her to do that. By the way, Haley is one of 2 former students named Haley who was presented with me at the AHA with this group, right? When you give students this kind of excitement and joy, and it's me at my meest, because I actually want to read what they're, you know, hey, did you talk to the guy who runs the pumpkin house? What'd he say? You know, and then explaining that that's the same thing historians do. So Marshall's, of course, famous for the 1970 plane crash. Here we are, we created a walking tour where students interviewed alumni. And I need to make those introductions for them, but then they're off running. So you can walk around our campus and hear stories from alumni and faculty. We even digitized the 1972 dedication speech of the Memorial Fountain so you can hear it. It's a goosebump moment. It sounds like those words are bouncing off. You are in 1972. My students tell me when I use it, I see everything in black and white. Up in the corner, that's where I got my driver's license renewed. Nothing excited about that place, except for it actually was a World War II factory. And one of my students found a Rosie the Riveter who worked there. So even when I'm at the DMV now, I can be surrounded by history and hear those voices. And then the bottom right corner is a simple bench. You wouldn't probably notice it, except for it was dedicated in memory of Julian Bond. My student interviewed a freedom writer who was one of his good friends, and then on her own found Pam Horowitz, his widow, interviewed, and you embedded those so you can sit there on the bench and it's like you're listening and you're with Julian Bond's friends. These were all done by History 200 students. The two in the corners there were our future teachers. They're going to get to tell the story to their kids when they're 70 years old. I met a freedom rider. I met a Rosie the Riveter. And that's the kind of thing that kind of keeps me going too. And so that's what I've learned during the pandemic, is that there's no sustained learning without joy. And this job should be fun. All right, that's what I got. Thank you so much.
David, thanks so much. I remember when the AHA kicked off the tuning project in 2012, and one of the speakers that Jim Grossman brought in to introduce the topic was Patty Limerick, and the whole focus of her presentation. Not so much content, skills, testing, instructions. One of the keys, what is the joy that you bring into this coursework? Your deep engagement with this work and with your students. David, I'm glad that message is still alive in 2021 with your work. Our next and our last presenter in this series of presentations is John Bezis-Selfa. John is an associate professor of history at Wheaton College, Massachusetts. His work focuses on the history of the Americas, Latinx history, environmental history, the links within language, politics, and identity. One of the books he's written, Forging America, Ironworkers, Adventurers, and the Industrious Revolution. He's also co-authored a work entitled American Horizons, U.S. History in a Global Context. He's grounded his long-term work in AHA tuning and other teaching projects, both as a faculty member and as a department head, trying to bring along other faculty members into these new ways of looking at our courses. His presentation today is also going to examine a key question that probably most of us have come across from students. The question runs something like this. Man, your history course has so much reading. How do I get through it? John's going to look at ways we can walk students through the distinctive process of reading in our discipline, and also completing writing assignments that are focused on that reading. John?
Thanks, Dan. Debbie and Victor, thanks for helping us set this up. I want to thank my fellow panelists. Dan truly saved the least able for last, as you'll quickly realize when you look at my PowerPoint. And I want to say another thing, which is that at an in-person AHA presentation, normally the panelists are thrilled if they can get, say, a multiple of 2 in the audience of the number of people on the panel. And I'd like to point out, for those of you who haven't seen, we have 120 people on this call right now, on this seminar right now, which I think is terrific. So welcome to you all. Welcome especially to those of you who are in Texas. And thanks for joining us. I know power is short for many of you right now, so welcome. Okay, I can't really say that this is something that I am doing differently, in the sense that I have really tried to focus on teaching reading at the introductory level precisely because students have enormous difficulty with it. My sense is that students are increasingly having difficulty with reading. And one of the things that we know is that frequently when students have difficulty with reading, they also have difficulty with expressing themselves in writing. So let's get to it. So let's first figure out where students are. And where we find, many, perhaps most of our students is really in the realm of information retrieval. And in other words, they are reading for the purposes of gathering information that they didn't have before. And then in a sense, showing or presenting what they have gathered to some, educational figure of authority, like us or a teacher or something. And we can't blame them for that. That's what they've mostly been asked to do when they read. And where we really need them to be is in a very different place, in the place that Julia is trying to get them. And I'm very grateful for Julia's terrific presentation, because that means that I can de-emphasize some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about later, because it's basically going to reiterate some of what she did. But we need them to be at a place in which they are engaged readers. In which they are not simply trying to answer questions, but also thinking about how to ask them, right? And then figure out how to answer the questions that they have posed. So really, there are really three stages to reading, right? Before, during, and after. So let me get to those. So the first thing is that I tell students is step one in their reading is before they read, right? Which is really the question of identification. What am I working with? And so the question that a historian always asks is, okay, do I consider this a primary source or a secondary source? Now, why does this matter, right? Obviously, it matters to us because we read them very differently. And I think one of the aspects of historical thinking that I want to impart to every student in every course, but particularly to introductory courses, is that historians work with information differently than other disciplines do. And that, depending, and that, what we consider, what we prioritize for information, what we consider, the information we consider most valuable, is often different from other disciplines, right? And so when it comes to the mechanics of reading, one of the things that I try and get across very, 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 repeatedly to students is that there is not just one way to read as a historian, right? There is a way to read as a historian when I was reading a primary source, and there was a way to read as a historian when one is reading a secondary source. And so here you can see I have some, I give them a functional definition of what a primary and secondary source is here. In the Wheaton history curriculum, in our introductory 100 level courses, we prioritize primary sources over anything else. And so we might introduce, say, short textbook readings, or say readings from scholarly journal articles, as I do in my US Survey History course. We might introduce those at the introductory level. We don't really get into monographs until we get to the intermediate and advanced levels. So before the students read, they have to make the determination. Okay, am I working with a primary, or am I working with a secondary source? When we get to step two, right, once they have made the determination, they have to then engage with the source, right? And in this case, I'm not really going to spend a lot of time going over the primary source stuff. There are two things that I would emphasize that are perhaps a little different from what Julia said. And one of those is that I really want students to take notes. I don't want them just to mark up, so in other words, if they're working with a hard copy, if they're working with the page, I don't want them to just highlight. I don't want them to sort of doodle a word or two and, or an image in the margins. I really want them to take notes. If they want to take it a computer file, great. If they want to take it on a separate piece of paper, great. But I want them to take notes, because when they are taking notes, they are beginning the process of understanding what the reading is said in their own words and on their own terms. And they can't do that necessarily if they're simply highlighting. The other thing that I emphasize enormously in reading primary sources is a secondary source. A student can get away with sort of giving it a quick skim to figure out what the basic gist is, and then to read it through, maybe give it one read and they're done. With a primary source, they have to reread it twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times. Obviously, if it's an assignment in class that they're doing, they're not going to read it over 3, 4, or 5 times. But these guidelines are designed for a student who is reading asynchronously outside of class. And the reason is, I think, because I guess a profound difference between reading a primary source and a secondary source that I often tell students is that you read a secondary source. With a primary source, you don't just read, you listen, right? And sometimes the listening involves, because students sometimes have difficulty with the language and syntax that's used in a primary source, sometimes what I tell them is read it aloud, right? Especially if you're by yourself, read it aloud, see if that helps you make sense of it. If you read it aloud, maybe you can hear the voice of that source coming through how you're reading aloud. Because really in primary source reading, this is where the opportunity to learn and practice historical empathy lies, right? And it's very difficult for students to learn that if they are simply scanning over the source, perhaps doing some information retrieval and leaving it at that. Now, the other thing that I would say is to help students with engaging sources, I always give them a guide with questions to help structure their reading and perhaps, if necessary, structure their note-taking. And in the case of primary source engagement, in the introductory course, they have to write 2 formal expository essays in which the principal evidence for those essays comes from primary source material. And so one of the things that you will notice is that, in the steps that I've given them is the steps are slightly different depending on whether they have to write an essay or not, right? Some cases they're doing this just for the purposes of discussion. Sometimes they're doing it because they actually need to write an essay. And then last but not least is, what happens after they read, right? And so this is review and this is processing. And so, this is partly why I want them to take notes, because I'd rather them review the notes than review the actual source itself. If they are writing an essay, you can see on the primary source side, if they're writing an essay, they're sort of given different guidance on how to proceed and where to proceed next. And in the secondary source, for the purposes of an intro course, this would really most for the purposes of discussion. And one thing that I would notice on secondary source reading, I don't know if all of you have noticed this, is that students, I find, increasingly have difficulty distinguishing between an argument or a thesis and what I'll call a task description. So the difference between, this chapter argues that New Mexico became a state that was more attuned to language rights during the Progressive era, as opposed to a task description. This chapter is about New Mexico during the Progressive era, right? Or something like that. I find that students are having enormous difficulty with that, with the distinguishing between the two. And it's not, again, that's not a crucial issue for the intro course because they do relatively little secondary source reading for that course, but it certainly is in the intermediate courses and up. All right, so I am looking forward, as my fellow panelists are, to your comments and your questions. Thank you.
John, thanks so much. And as with other presentations, I'm really taken by the way my colleagues have so carefully thought about these issues of breaking down a project into manageable steps and making that breakdown of instructions appropriate, not only to a course, but to the students in that class. Between the presence or the absence of specialized disciplinary knowledge, the particular conditions they face in life, the expectations they have, I think this is a wonderful example of ways in which the Gateways Project has helped colleagues rethink what's going on in day-to-day operation of a course and their relationship with our students. Just wonderful. Rather than me yammering on even longer, Debbie, I'm wondering if you've had some questions come in that we could field to our panelists that can take this conversation even further.
Yeah, we've got, it looks like there's 4 open questions in the Q&A. I don't know if you want to skim through or I can prompt some. The first is from Craig Perrier, who's asking to what extent Harvard's Project Zero thinking routines have become part of you and your colleagues' practices. It's a parallel to a presentation that he did on a webinar earlier this month.
Boy, Craig, I'm embarrassed to say I'm not familiar with this and that I've missed this webinar. Are any of the panelists familiar with Project Zero from Harvard? Boy, I'm sorry.
Right.
I'm sorry. I mean, I'm glad that there are even more projects that we can go to amplify what we're doing in the Gateways Project. Craig, thanks for the suggestion, and I'll certainly be visiting their site to see what this is all about.
And I'll leave that in the Q&A so people can see the
Thanks.
link. The next question is from Jennifer Sessions. To quickly paraphrase, she's inspired by the conversation, but as a Europeanist is struggling to think how she could apply some of these local history things that Reggie and David talked about in her classes, and wondering if anyone has any ideas about that.
Jennifer and I have been having a little bit, this is bad practices, but I saw it on Twitter pop up. So she and I have been talking back and forth on Twitter a little bit, and she's a wonderful French historian. And I think that she has a point here where she says, you know, sometimes these conversations can make it so that non-US historians can sometimes feel a little bit at sea with how exactly they can do these community-based projects. And I think some of the things that we've been talking about on Twitter have been, you know, Google Earth field trips that you can take to certain places. Something that just popped into my mind too is there's a lot of very cool visualizations of 17th and 18th century European towns at the moment, where they have recreated songs and sort of the oral experience of what was happening there that you could get students invested in. But I think that this is a bigger issue that needs to be addressed, and perhaps this is a point to a tete-a-tete or another type of a meeting that perhaps the AHA could sponsor going forward, is how do people who are non-US historians do this? I think that point that Jennifer makes is super important. But do any of the other panelists have ideas for the non-modernists and the non-US historians?
Yeah, we're awfully spoiled. Awfully spoiled in our work with U.S. history. I also wanted to mention, this was in a question that came up earlier, that the data that the Gardner Institute and Drew Koch has collected about intro courses has focused on U.S. history, but they are gathering more data since that 2017 article about what has traditionally been called Western Civ and world history and other survey courses, introducing students to various fields and regions of the world and different cultures. So I think we're going to get more information about other intro courses. And I agree with Julia. I think one thing that this prompts the Gateways Project to consider is to break away from U.S. history and talk about these other regions. The only thing that came to mind, Julia, when you were making your comments was something I do in a U.S. history course. One of my first projects with students who are adults, who are working adults, who are in rural areas of our state, who are working towards an associate's degree in over a series of disciplines in Gen Ed, is to have them write a story about their family's educational history. to give them a sense of their place in that story. And it strikes me that perhaps, especially if someone's teaching a European introductory course, if for many students, certainly not for all, if you can ask students to do a bit of genealogy, where are their families from? I guess this can apply to any intro course. What's the history that their family contains? And how might that tie back to areas outside of the US, around the world? And that might fit into a project that a teacher can develop in a European survey or surveys of African history, Asian history, and the like. It's just a thought that's come to mind. But starting with what's known and familiar to students and building out from that to give them a sense of the historical link that they personally have to so many areas of the world.
And I just want to reemphasize, while I agree with Jennifer, this was definitely Jennifer's sort of thought here about the non-US historians and opening this up, but I very much agree with her. And I just want to say in the Q&A, Norm Jones, who is he's one of Dan and I's colleagues as well, and studies Tudor England, has said, you know, the digital resources are there for non-modernists, and he likes to use paleography as it opens up a new world of primary sources that students can experience, which I think is true. But I think that, you know, as Jennifer said, this is signaling, you know, a larger conversation, I think, for Europeanists and Africanists and Asianists and world historians to get together and to think about these gateway courses, world history in particular, Western Civ, which is, you know, being replaced with history of Europe appropriately, in these conversations that we need to have, I think, as a discipline too, especially for pre-modernists as well.
I'm muted, sorry. We have another question from James White, who's asking, why should we assign primary sources with difficult and outdated syntax as opposed to modern sources with a strong voice? Would it be worthwhile to give students that help them understand how history operates in society? Just to paraphrase a little, rather than assigning Thomas Jefferson, but it'd be worthwhile assigning the back and forth between the 1619 project editors and historians critical of the project to encourage students to think about how history operates in their lives now and how to analyze sources they're more likely to encounter in their everyday lives.
I guess my response, I think it's a great question. And I guess my response to that would be to answer it with a question is, why can't we do both? Right? I mean, I think that the engaging something like the 1619 project and its critics is a great way to get at conversations about what history is and what it's for, right? And about how and the differences between, say, how academic historians view history and how people outside the academy view history. I think that's really valuable. I actually value in limited doses the difficulty of primary sources. Precisely because one of the things that I think we want to get across to people, to our students, especially in the intro courses, is that the past is different, right? They thought differently there, they wrote differently there, they spoke differently there. They're kind of hard. I mean, they're kind of hard for us to understand. So that would be my response, which is, both is fine. I've seen nothing wrong with that.
Also, just as a pre-modernist, I do want to say, just because something is old and difficult doesn't mean that we should not look at it. I think that it's like John, I think looking at both is super important, but assigning something by Thomas Jefferson is often an important part of history to get them to read the voices and opinions of those in the past. And especially as we are incorporating more and more primary sources from marginalized groups and from the voices of people who have been previously oppressed. I think that's really important to continue doing and not to have just this, I think, modernist approach to everything. I think it's really important for students to see people like themselves in the past and to hear their voices and their opinions. So while they might grapple with that, I think that's a really important historical skill and something that we can give students so they can see kind of the continual struggle of humanity over time.
Yeah, and one of the things I'll do when I assign a text that is admittedly advanced, I will author a guide that is remarkably precise in terms of using pages 237 to 275, and with this context, answer this. And that tends to compress the questions that they might have, and really kind of help to get them started. And then I sort of pull away that scaffolding over time. It's not, it's a process. It's a process, not a final product. And I also spend a lot of time explaining to them, I expect you to get these things wrong. And in fact, if you don't, I'm going to have some questions of how do you know so much about this particular thing? And so I try to just emphasize that this is a place where they are free to fail honestly.
Debbie, can I take up these comments with two other questions that came in? One from Bob Bain and the other from Rebecca Mergenthal. Both of them are asking a similar type of question. What have you tried that hasn't worked in these classes? And I'll just give an example of this. I'm sure we've all gone through this. An example that fits in, especially with Rebecca's question about grading practices, what's worked and what hasn't worked. And I think also answers Bob's question. A recent time when what we presented didn't work as we thought. It has involved grading. And it's made me think, you know what, I've got to scaffold this grading. Rather than giving an assignment and giving it a lower amount of points, I've now moved to a different system where an assignment breaks down into component parts, and the first parts don't have any grade. These are just messages that I share with students. These are emails that they're sending to me about their project. And they send me a statement. I try to work with them on how to strengthen it, what other kinds of questions to ask. I'm checking off a box. They've done this part of the assignment, but it doesn't have any grade associated with it. I'm trying to get students to remain confident about continuing their work here. And as David just said, anticipate screwing up some of the particular points here. We all do it. You're not going to be, quote, punished with a lower grade. I want to use this opportunity to figure out where you are in understanding this assignment, where I haven't been clear enough to you, and how we can both work together to strengthen the next step and the step after that. This is all very time consuming. We all recognize that. But as Julia mentioned in her earlier comments, it actually turns out to be pretty productive, because catching these mistakes at an early point helps to move the work at a later point in the academic term a little bit faster. So Bob and Rebecca, those are some issues I've come across. Let me just open this up to others, though.
Yeah, I would like to add to that. The first time that I taught the course that I explained, that I would consider that I failed, right? Because the students, I graded everything very, very critically and harshly. And midpoint of the semester, I could see the students really becoming turned off with the concept of the course, because it was a new concept, right? I wasn't lecturing every day. I wasn't giving historical fact every day. It was really the students going out and creating something that they didn't know that they were creating. But it required those students to read outside of class and to come into class to engage the work. And it required the students to do some primary research. It required the students to go be engaged in the community, and it also required the students to write intensely. And so what I realized, to Dan's point earlier, is that I had to scaffold the grading. I had to give the students opportunity to do some peer grading. I had to give the students opportunity to revise their work, because what I did not want to do, what I learned is that I don't want to dampen their enthusiasm about the course, because along the way they have a feeling that they're going to fail the course if they don't do exactly what I'm asking them to do. But in my mind, what I'm asking them to do is really, engage the field in a way that they haven't engaged before. So I had to communicate with them different. I had to think about how the grade, because if we can be honest, a lot of our students, they only care about their grade. And so one of the things that I had to do is change that narrative about, what is the grade and why this grade is important. And then it goes back to me explaining to them at the beginning of the semester, these are the skills that you will attain after you leave this class. And so they start to understand that that's what I was really, really looking for. And that's really what I started to grade. But it took me, honestly, about 3 years. I only taught the course once a semester, once the academic year, that was in the fall. And by the 3rd year that I taught the class, it was a well-oiled machine.
I moved to specification grading last semester for a couple of assignments, meaning like check, check plus, or check minus, which was, recommended by Small Online Teaching by Flower Darby. And I thought, oh, this will be a great way where I can still check in with the students, reward them for their work. What I noticed was that with this, and I think, Reggie, this is very similar to what you were saying, the students didn't feel engaged with that. They started to view the assignment as just literally, as I was grading it, a check mark. And I realized that while I may not have as much time with remote learning, with larger classes of online students, with more demands to get things up, it still is necessary to give that personalized feedback to students, even if it's not like the most tailored to each individual student, even if it's, a comment from a comment bank of, you did this really well that I can copy and paste. That gets students engaged, that gets students understanding that we see them, which I think is part of this DWI issue too, is that we see them, we're willing to work with them. Once I saw that change of completely abandoning the specifications grading of check, check minus, check plus, and moving back towards that, the students really did get engaged in the materials again. And they started to really value it because they do care about their grades and they do care about that. But I think they also want somebody to see them working through that process and know that we are there for them. The amount of, this sounds like a humble brag, it's not, but the amount of students that contact me and were like, thank you so much for writing a personal comment. Thank you so much for caring about me. And I'm sure many of you who are here because you care about your students, you care about your teaching, that's why you're at this virtual event, have probably experienced that as well. And that's a way that we can still make those connections that I think are important.
One of the things I picked up, there's a nice Twitter thread going on as well. And one of the things that seems like people appreciated was just the level of honesty about teaching. Sometimes we fail to be honest about how much we fail. And so what's the worst thing I've done recently that I can share? And that's, I think I've tried to incorporate group projects and failed repeatedly. That was one of the things I heard a lot from the interesting people I talked about, was how important relationships were, especially when I talked to retirees, and how we need to do, they talked about relationships they developed in college. And I thought, okay, I'm going to try group projects. And after failing enough, I figured out I need to get them together the first time. I need to host their first meeting. They'll all show up and they'll all get on the right page. And then I pull myself away. And so I finally figured out how to do group projects. And then the pandemic hit. And then, like an idiot, I forgot what I learned because I just thought they would all, they're young, they know, they're hip, and they know technology, and they're going to all know how to use Zoom. They already know. They absolutely didn't. And so in the spring of last year, my group projects utterly fell apart, and it was my fault for not doing the same thing I was doing in the physical classroom of having of hosting that first meeting. And so that was one of the lessons I've learned painfully.
To one more point to that, my course is built off of group projects. And one of the things that I learned is, having, dedicating 2 or 3 class sessions on properly running a group meeting and having the students develop a group contract together, and then having the students present that contract out in class. So it's not that one person wrote the contract and then we all agree, right? And so I learned that you create the accountability piece for the students in class. And so what I saw throughout the semester was that the students really started to understand the concept of a group project and why the project was important, that they were responsible of holding each other accountable, and they had power within the group. But it took me, again, three academic years to really figure all of that out. And so I have a 3-ring binder with contracts from over the years that the students sign and that I sign, and it gives them power, and it gives me power to then step in if I need to step in. But yeah, trial and error.
I think that, I can talk about one thing that worked and one thing that didn't in the intro course. And the last time that I taught it was before the pandemic. So, most of what I'm going to say would go out the window in a mixed modality or a remote modality course. But anyway, I quickly realized that students liked working together, and I have a policy that as long as the enrollment allows, I try and have each student do 2 presentations a semester, usually one in a team and one individually. And for this particular intro course, I decided to have them do 2 team presentations. And I gave them a specific topic, or I might give them a question that their presentation was supposed to answer. And they were supposed to go to the textbook basically to gather up, most of what they would need to present. And I asked them to do most of the prep work and the teamwork in class, where I could see them, or I could help them, or it wouldn't feel necessarily like it was something that was burdensome outside of class. When it came time to do the presentations, they knew what the rubric was. I graded them very easily, particularly in the event that somebody decided to go AWOL or somebody didn't do a particularly good job. I didn't necessarily want that to have a negative impact on on the grade that the other students in the group earned. The thing that I honestly did not work well was that same semester where in response to the Kavanaugh hearings were going on at the same time. And, I watched the white guy in the MAGA hat on one side of the room, go against, most of the rest of the class on the other side of the room. And to me, the most interesting person, the most troubling person in that whole exchange was the one who was basically in the duck and cover position, pleading for it to end because he was hearing about this, these hearings in every single course, and he just couldn't take it anymore, and he was clearly in distress. And I tried to devise an assignment, a research assignment for students individually in response to that. And it's what often happens where the sort of best prepared students did well, and the students that weren't so prepared didn't do well. So I was, I like the concept of the assignment, but I wasn't through with the outcome.
I know we're running late. I don't want to take advantage of the wonderful audience that's stuck with us through this long discussion. I hope you can see that we're all struggling to understand how we deal with the difficult issues that the Gardner Institute's research on intro courses has created for us. The wake-up call that I hope we all feel we need to respond to in as thoughtful and critical a way as possible. Everybody on this panel is still struggling with this issue. We're trying all kinds of experiments. And I think that's part of the strength of not only my friends here, but of you in the audience, and especially of the American Historical Association, its teaching division, and the various projects that it's sponsored over decades to help us in the classroom and to help us create a learning environment for our students that pays off in terms of understanding, enrichment, civic life, and careers. This conversation is going to continue, as is the History Gateways project. And I hope that as we continue the discussion, we're not only focusing on the data that we need to attend to, the larger strategies, but also very simple, direct, concrete, and practical examples of what we might be able to do individually or as members of a department to change what we're providing for our students and to be more attentive to the more diverse student body we have in the third decade of this century, and the needs that they hope to fulfill in our classes. I want to thank all of our colleagues. Debbie, thanks so much for your help too. I hope I'm not closing this off too suddenly, but just again, trying to be thoughtful of our audience and their time as well. Thanks so much to all of you for participating in this work. I'm deeply grateful, especially to the AHA for the attention they've given to these kinds of issues for so many decades, not just in our research, but in our teaching as well. Thanks, everybody.
And I'll close this out with one last thank you to our sponsors, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Stanton Foundation, the History Channel, and Oxford University Press. Thanks to everyone for your questions and comments. And finally, a special thanks to the panelists. Have a great day and stay warm out there.